Okay, so this is my NIX 91 stealth car. I was originally going to do a build series for this, but I got so into the build that I just kind of figured I would finish the whole thing before making a video. So let's see, where do I want to start? I'll start with the 3D printed parts and the parts preparation. That's probably the most involved part of this build. Actually, you know what? Before I get to that, I want to point out that this build is for experienced RC modelers only. And the reason for that is because it does not come with a conventional parts manual or build manual. All you really get is a parts diagram like this telling you what parts you need, at least for the main part of the build. But you know, you have to know beforehand, okay, I have to build the shocks. It doesn't tell you how to build the shocks. I gotta get a stealth transmission. It doesn't tell you how to build that, right? So you know, this is just a very basic overview of what you need to do to complete this kit. But you have to have experience with RC10s from, you know, past experience in order to really know what you're doing with this thing. So just bear that in mind. Like, for example, you know, the different screws that you use, it doesn't really tell you what screw size to use. It just tells you what parts you need. So you have to know beforehand what to use. But that being said, I'm going to try to walk you through a little bit about the build. So again, these parts are the suspension components, like the suspension arms, the bulkhead, the steering arm, caster block, the rear hub carriers, the rear arms, the rear arm mounts. Those are all 3D printed, and of course the rear bumper, 3D printed parts. So because they're 3D printed, they're going to have a finite resolution. They're not made from molds. They're printed using, you know, basically a printer head like you would have on a normal printer, but this printer head moves in 3 dimensions. And each pixel that you print has a finite size. So that means if you want to print a fine feature, for example, a round hole with a very specific diameter of that hole and a nice smooth surface for an actual circular hole, is not going to print perfectly. So what that means is a lot of times you might get, say, suspension arms where the holes aren't actual holes. They might actually be filled a little bit with plastic. So, you know, that's just a normal part of the 3D printing process, at least for what is currently considered to be modern 3D printing technology. You just have to deal with it. So you can't just expect to buy the parts and then throw them on the car. You have to drill out all of the holes that you mount hinge pins onto and king pins through, every single one of them. And for any hole that you're going to screw a screw into, you have to tap all of those holes first before you screw a screw in there. So every screw hole you have to tap, every hinge pin hole, you have to drill it out. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about this. If you try to shove a hinge pin through a hole, it might not even go through, again, because the hole might not actually be a complete hole through the whole part. And if you just try to, you know, screw, say, a screw into a screw hole before tapping it out, the screw hole might be too small. And so when you shove a screw in there, it's going to put stress in the surrounding plastic, and that may cause the plastic to break. So it's a lot of preparation to put these parts together. And that becomes a problem later. For example, if you break a suspension arm, then what you have to do is not only buy another suspension arm, which are expensive. A pair of suspension arms is about $20. But you also have to re-prepare it all over again. And it's not just drilling and tapping that matters, at least for the front suspension arms. You also have to do a little bit of shaving. So I'll get into that right now, actually. So a friend of mine that I have that actually uses his NIX 91 as a runner, he pointed out that, and rightly so, sorry, put this in place here. If you have full steering throw, say I make a left-hand turn, so steering does this, okay, and that puts a load on the right side of the chassis, so the right suspension will compress. What that means is the arm moves up into the steering rack, and there's not quite enough clearance there for these two to not touch. So you have to shave out part of the suspension arm towards the rear in order for it to clear the rack at full compression of the shock. So you have to, again, tap the holes, drill the holes, grind the arms down a little bit to make everything work. And if you break an arm, you got to do that all over again. Now, what I did to deal with this, I did grind the arms down a little bit. But one thing I also did was to use a slightly thicker nut here to push the steering rack up a little bit to buy me a little bit more space for clearance, but it also means I don't have to grind out quite as much material on the arm to get clearance between the arm and the steering rack at full compression. You do actually get a pair of nuts to go in here for these screws that mount into the steering rack with the kit, but those nuts are a little thinner. So I use just a thicker nut to push the steering rack up. Speaking of the steering rack, again, this you got to tap everything, right? So this body mount post is actually part of a larger piece that slots through the upper and lower bearings for this side of the steering rack. And your 832 thread screw that you mount into the steering rack screws into this post. So you have to tap that out with an 832 tap. Otherwise, you can end up breaking this front body mount post. I have heard about people snapping that before. So you got to watch out for that. Also, with the steering rack itself, because some of these things come in parts trees, like the caster block and the steering arms, that comes as a parts tree, and the steering rack with these with the body mount post, and oops, this little nut that goes in on this side, that all comes as a parts tree. So you got to snap everything out, and make sure there's no flashing or anything, and make sure that the inside chamber here that the steering rack bearings mount into, the bearings can actually slot in smoothly, so you have to shave that out a little bit. And then the body mount post, and also this nut here that has like a piston basically that slots through the bearings. You have to make sure that that's smooth and that slots through the bearings smoothly. So there's a lot of prep work for that. Going to the rear suspension arms, I had found, at least for me, that I did have to do a little bit of grinding towards the rear of the arms in order for the arm to go to full droop while clearing the rear of the chassis. Okay, a little bit of grinding, not a whole lot. Now, you may be able to notice that this shade of black here is a little bit off. It looks more like purple compared to this shade of black. That's because the black 3D printed parts are only black on the surface. Once you grind a part down, you can actually see it, sorry, you can see it a little bit better here. Once you grind a part down, the exposed plastic is actually white. The core of the plastic is white. So if you want to keep everything black with a black part, or you can get other colors if you want, I just took a Sharpie and just kind of drew over the exposed white pieces to try to keep the whole surface blackish. Okay, so that's just kind of an aesthetic thing. But in any case, again, there is some prep you have to do for the rear arms here to get a little bit more droop, or at least a little bit more of a free suspension movement on the arm. Okay, I did end up using just some 3M protective sheet on the bottom of the chassis, although apparently you can use a Yokomo YZ10, like a 94 YZ10 under tray, and cut it to fit, and it will fit just fine. I didn't want to do that, so I just used a standard protective sheet, although I did end up cutting out holes for each of the screws. This is kind of, you can do this one of two ways. What some people do is they mount all the screws, they put everything together, then they put the protective sheet on. But then what ends up happening is the protective sheet covers all of your screws. So if for whatever reason you need to unscrew something, you have to cut holes in the sheet to get to the screw. What I basically did is I kind of put the sheet on, and then when the holes were in the chassis, I just, before I mounted the screw, because the holes in the chassis, I just used that as a guide to cut little holes out in the protective sheet. You can go one way or the other, it doesn't matter, but at the end of the day, you do have holes in the protective sheet that create a surface that can start wearing away when the chassis grinds against the ground. So that can be a problem, but I digress. Okay, so a fair bit about the parts here, 3D printed parts. They take a lot of work to prepare and to get them to run smoothly. The only other part that was kind of an issue was the rear suspension arm mount here, this hinge pin mount. So basically, you drill out the hole here for the hinge pin. That's fine, no big deal. And you mount everything. And in order to, if you want to remove this hinge pin, say to replace the arm, what I found is you actually have to remove this rear screw here. because the screw is really close to the hinge pin in proximity, such that when we actually thread this screw in, it puts a little bit of stress, some compressive stress on the plastic between the screw and the hinge pin. And it creates just enough bind such that you can't actually pull this hinge pin out. Now that's good for holding it in place when you're running it, but if you want to pull it out, you actually have to take the screw out to relieve that stress a little bit so that this hinge pin can actually come out nice and smoothly. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The stealth gearbox is just a stealth gearbox. There's nothing really special about that. I just used, as many new components as I could find. This gear cover here is an RPM gear cover for the VTS slipper. So I have a B4 top shaft with a VTS slipper clutch here, although you can't see it because the gear cover's there. But that's what I'm running there. Other notes to consider, the battery mounting. Excuse me. All you do is you use 2 battery cups here, and they screw into the chassis, and then you can use whatever assortment of parts you want for the top to actually hold the battery down. So you can order, I think from A-Main, I think it's like an RC10 T or GT battery cup pair. It comes as a pair of black battery cups. So it comes with 2 battery cups and 2 of these plastic top braces here. But if I use both top braces, then there's this big open gap here that won't hold anything down. But as long as your battery is all the way at the front, all the way at the rear, and you just put foam spacers on the open space, it's not a problem. But say you want to mount your shorty pack in the middle. If I have these 2 braces on the side, it won't hold anything down. So the guys that actually make this chassis, they do sell like this X-shaped brace to, hold down anything anywhere along this surface, and that's great. But I just happen to have a spare T4 battery plate, if you want to call it that. I just cut off the front here, and I slotted it under this rear brace here, so that way I just, undo these 2 thumb screws, and this comes out, and I can put the battery anywhere I want, put foam spacers in, and put this down, and it'll hold everything down just fine. So that's it for the batteries. For the shocks, so these are, standard Teflon coated, Team Associated, old school shocks. The only differences, the only things I changed, well, the obvious one is on the outside. I used big bore springs. The standard bore springs do grind against the shock body, and these are almost brand new shocks, so I wanted to keep them nice. So to minimize binding between the shock body and the springs, just use a big bore spring. Traxxas makes like a little spring holder thing. I forgot the actual part, but that holds a big bore spring at the top. And then I just use, associated big bore spring cups at the bottom, and I just, put a big bore spring in there. No big deal. The shock shafts, I'm using the Proline black diamond coated shock shafts. I got them on a big sale, like $7 for a pair or something. They used to sell for, I think, around $30 for a pair. So I guess they didn't sell as well as Proline had hoped, probably because they were horrendously overpriced. So I got a nice deal on a whole bunch of them. So I figured I'd use them for this build. They are pretty smooth. I mean, they're supposed to be smoother than your standard shock shafts, but in honesty, they're not that much smoother than the tinitride coated, the gold colored shock shafts you can get for Team Associated. So, I'd say they're about the same in terms of shock feel, but I wanted to try them out. And for the shock seals, I used X-ring shock seals. You don't have to use the standard red O-rings that come with the shock rebuild kit for these older shocks. You can buy a set of modern X-rings and throw them in there, and they work just fine. And they're nice and smooth, and it feels really great. So that's what I did. Let's see, what else? So that's kind of it for the build. I mean, a lot of it is just preparing these 3D printed parts. And I did mention that I was going to use this as a runner. That is my long-term plan, but right now I'm actually going to shelf it. And the reason for that is, well, there's a few reasons. First, I already have a RC10 team car that I found a good setup with, and I'm very happy with it, so I don't really need to use this as a runner. But secondly, and most importantly, there have been some parts quality issues that have been affecting people in the United States that have been running this. So a little bit of a backstory, the guy that designed this and put this together lives in the Netherlands. And Shapeways has two facilities. There's a facility in the Netherlands that prints 3D parts, and there's a facility in New York that prints 3D parts. So when he orders his parts for the hub carriers and the arms and everything, he gets those straight from the Netherlands plant. If you live in the United States and you order parts, you don't have an option of ordering from either plant. You just get it by default from the 3D print factory, if you want to call it that, that's based in New York. And apparently there's a difference in the quality of the part for the same exact part. So if you order, say, a pair of front arms from the New York facility, they'll be weaker than if you ordered the same exact arms from the Netherlands facility. It's not exactly clear why, but there are people in the US that have tried to use this as runners, and they take the car out, they go over one jump, and all of a sudden the rear arm would snap for no apparent reason, or the hub carrier would snap along like the grain boundaries for the 3D printed little pixels that define the part. Like, it's really bad. So since I live in the US, all my 3D printed parts are from the New York facility. It's fine if you're just making a shelf queen, but if you're gonna make an actual runner, I don't think it's really a worthwhile endeavor to use the New York printed parts. I mean, it's, again, $20 for a pair of arms. So if you break an arm, it's 20 bucks. And plus all the time you have to do, you know, threading all of the screw holes and drilling out the hinge pin holes and grinding down the arm where you need to get it to move freely. It's not a simple replacement of a part that you break. It actually takes a lot of work to actually prepare the part and make it work correctly. So I'm going to wait until either Shapeways finds a way for US customers to order from the Netherlands plant, or until they improve the quality of the parts from their New York plant. Until that happens, this is staying on the shelf because it's just too expensive to order spares. Now, you know, in fairness, this whole kit is very expensive, so what's $20 over, I don't know, $500 or $600 it takes to build this? It's not much, but it does add up over time. You know, 4 or 5 breakages of your arms, that's almost $100. It's crazy. So I'm going to put this aside for now, but I do have an RPM Worlds kit that I want to play around with. So I finally found a use for my orange RC10 chassis. I'm going to do basically, you know, a long wheelbase conversion with the RPM long front arms and the RPM long rear arms, and that's basically a stronger version of this chassis. And, you know, it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar geometry. It probably weighs more because of the aluminum chassis, but it'll be a much better, more robust runner if I want to use something like with, you know, this shape and geometry as a runner. I think that's about all I had to mention. Now, this is not to, you know, I really like this kit. I don't want to create the wrong impression or anything. I think the guys that put this together did an awesome job. You know, and if you live in the Netherlands, it's great because you get really high quality 3D printed parts. The guy that orders his parts, he said, you know, he's beaten the bejesus out of his arms and they, you know, they haven't broken, which is awesome. I just can't wait until we actually get that kind of parts quality here in the United States. Until that happens, I have to shelve this. I really don't have a choice. But it's a really cool build. So if you do get a chance to get one of these and put it together, it's pretty neat. It's pretty neat to look at too. So I hope this was somewhat informative. I wish I could have made you know, a build series for this. But again, I just kind of got so into it, I just put it all together. But in any case, you know, if you have any questions, as usual, please post them in the comments section. I'll do my best to answer them. And in the meantime, thanks for watching.